Hi, I'm Dr. Kurt Wooler for Integrative Medicine Academy. I want to welcome you to this presentation. The title is Top 10 Reasons the Organic Acids Test is Needed for Every Individual with Chronic Health Problems. So I've been an integrative and functional medicine physician for over 2 decades. I've done a tremendous amount of clinical education for various labs, including Great Plains Laboratory and the teaching of their organic acid test seminar. I'm a speaker, educator, author, as well as a practicing clinician. I'm co-founder of Integrative Medicine Academy, which is a comprehensive online academy of different online courses in integrative medicine. I'm also the medical director of Functional Medicine Clinical Rounds. And in my own private practice, I've worked for years with individuals on the autism spectrum, patients with autoimmune disorders, neurological and gastrointestinal problems. So I wanted to profile why I feel the organic acids test from Great Plains Laboratory is the preferred test. You can also use other organic acid tests, but in my view, in my clinical experience, you're not going to get more comprehensive than what Great Plains offers. And there are some unique markers that the Great Plains OAT test provides. So organic acids are chemical compounds that all of us produce, and we excrete these in large amounts. They're concentrated in the urine, which is a reflection of what's in the body. And lactic acid, for example, is a common organic acid that our body produces, and there's many reasons it could be elevated. So it can give you a representation of underlying biochemical imbalances. But also there are organic acids that are produced in our body by organisms that live within our digestive system. So these organic acids that show up on an OAT test are representative of imbalances within the gut. So one of the first reasons, reason number one to learn how to do the organic acid test is yeast, candida, and other fungal toxin analysis. So if you look at page 1 of the organic acid test, there's different markers that are representative of underlying yeast problems, including candida, invasive candida, which would be represented here by marker 7, arabinose, and then different markers indicating gut colonization of mold, specifically Aspergillus mold and Fusarium mold. And we know that these organisms are highly invasive. So yeast as a category of fungus can invade the lining of the digestive system, leading to invasive candidiasis. And many times when it breaks down the lining of the gut, it can actually contribute to leaky gut as well. And one of the things that happens when we're getting invasive candida within the digestive tract is the production of arabinose. So arabinose gets expressed as an indication or a chemical indication of invasive candida. Other acids can be produced as well, like tartaric acid, which can also be associated with Aspergillus mold. Now, arabinose is a highly complex chemical, and it can actually interact with an amino acid called lysine, which forms a complex with arginine that forms pentosidines. And pentosidines fall in the same chemical group called advanced glycation end products that hemoglobin A1C comes from. And so these are actually known to trigger autoimmune disorders, even in the brain, and they damage what are called cross-linked proteins throughout the body. The other thing that happens with many of these yeast toxins is direct inhibition of the Krebs cycle, the Krebs cycle being that initial step in mitochondrial activity. So we know that yeast and candida toxins, fungal toxins, can cause mitochondrial disruption. If you look at the biochemistry of yeast metabolism of glucose, we can see that the end result is ethanol. Okay, and so actually many people will have alcohol-related symptoms when candida levels are very high. The autism population is very susceptible to this. And one of the things that Dr. Shaw from Great Plains Lab had highlighted many, many years ago was that autistic individuals tend to have very high levels of arabinose. It's not that neurotypical individuals don't have some, but it's the autistic kids that tend to have a lot higher levels. They're also much more susceptible to the existence of these Candida toxins. And if you look at many of the clinical observations that are seen or that are discussed in relationship to Candida overgrowth and autism, this silliness, goofiness, giddiness, inappropriate laughter, acting drunk is very, very typical, and other kind of odd behavior as well. And we know because when we treat many of these individuals with antifungal medications or botanicals, these types of behaviors disappear. So we can expect an improvement often in focusing and concentration, many times language issues, certainly bowel problems, behavioral issues, and then skin rashes and other types of things that are thought to be associated with Candida and other types of fungal infections. And this has been recognized for years. Okay, it's known that in the world of chronic fatigue syndrome, that oftentimes memory is improved, depression is improved, sleep problems are improved when individuals are put on antifungal medication. And so again, the organic acid test gives us good representation of organic acid toxin assessment of underlying fungal problems. The second reason to do the organic acids test is the assessment of Clostridia, bacterial toxins. We know that there are many different types of Clostridia bacteria. Most people focus on Clostridia difficile as a primary cause of gut problems, which it certainly is. There are other types of Clostridia that can be damaging as well. Now, we know that Clostridia difficile, or what's called C. diff, has led to, and still does, to many deaths here in the United States every year. The biggest thing with Clostridia is that it has a potential to recur. So it has very high recurrence. It's difficult to treat. There are different toxins of Clostridia difficile, particularly toxin A and B, which their primary effect is in the gut, leading to leaky gut, inflammation, bloody stools, etc. But it's important to realize that there are many different strains of Clostridia difficile. Not all of them produce toxin A and B. We know that these toxins in the gut can lead to what's called pseudomembranous colitis, an inflammatory bowel condition secondary to C. diff. But again, there are other toxins that get produced by Clostridia that aren't picked up in stool testing. They're only picked up in organic acids testing. This is a case analysis of a young woman who had acute schizophrenia and psychosis that was treated with a short course of vancomycin and completely eliminated or took away her psychotic episode secondary to schizophrenia. We also know that autistic individuals tend to have high levels of this particular compound called HPHPA, the same compound that was just profiled in the previous patient with schizophrenia. What ends up happening in many kids with autism who have high HPHPA or Clostridia in general is they can have a lot of behavioral problems, sometimes self-injurious behavior as well as aggressive behavior. And if we look at the properties of Clostridia bacteria, they're very tenacious organisms. There's over 100 species of Clostridia that are known to inhabit the GI tract in humans. Not all are pathogenic, but some of them are extremely pathogenic. Botulism, for example, tetanus are two types of conditions secondary to different types of Clostridia bacteria. These organisms form spores, which make them resilient and hardy and survivable outside the human body. It also makes them resistant to antibiotic treatments. The organic acids test from Great Plains looks at 4 different organic acids linked to the existence of Clostridia bacteria. Remember, stool testing is one option of testing, but it's only detecting the existence of certain strains of Clostridia difficile and the toxins A and B. These organic acids show up on the OAT test. These primarily have effects outside the digestive tract, particularly within the brain and nervous system. One of the things that happens in the existence of, let's say, 4-creosol and HPHPA from the organic acids test is they inhibit dopamine beta hydroxylase, that enzyme that converts dopamine to norepinephrine. What ends up happening is dopamine levels rise, and that causes an increase of homovanillic acid on the OAT test. Too much dopamine within the brain and nervous system is toxic. There is an overlap to how these neurotransmitters function. Okay, so dopamine is very much linked to the reward motivation system, but there's also effects on cognition, on attention, on aggressive behavior, appetite, for example. And so we know that when there is too much dopamine, it can many times lead to, in susceptible individuals, anxiety, psychosis, can also lead to aggression and self-injurious behavior. Dopamine breaks down into a chemical called dopamine-O-quinone. Dopamine-O-quinone triggers apoptosis of brain cells. It also generates a lot of free radicals, and that ultimately can lead to neurodegeneration within the brain and nervous system. Also will cause a depression or deficiency of glutathione over time, because glutathione is necessary to bind to the dopamine-O-quinone and render it less toxic. When we have an imbalance of dopamine, we also then tend to have an imbalance of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system. In many cases, that can lead to a fight or flight scenario, increase physical, mental, and emotional stress. Clostridia bacteria also some of them produce what's called propionic acid. And propionic acid can actually create chemical imbalances within the Krebs cycle. So we know that Clostridia bacteria, like Candida and other fungal organisms, can also lead to mitochondrial dysfunction. Reason number 3 for the OAT is helping to prioritize intervention for yeast and/or Clostridia bacteria. When we look at behavioral issues often linked to these organisms, Clostridia bacteria can lead to aggression, biting, kicking, screaming in children, for example, attention problems, psychosis in extreme situations. Yeast behavior classically can lead to self-stimulatory behavior, inappropriate laughter, silliness, goofiness, giddiness, particularly seen in autistic kids. But other people can have fatigue, attention problems, etc. So it helps us to get an idea about, when we correlate the information clinically to the individual, where we might want to put our efforts from a treatment standpoint first, and what might come next in a secondary position. Reason number 4 for the organic acid test from Great Plains is evaluating for high oxalates. Oxalates are organic compounds that come from many food. We know that diet is the #1 source of oxalates, but we also know that yeast and other fungus can produce oxalate as well. There are genetic factors that are linked to oxalate imbalances. B6 deficiencies can also create an oxalate accumulation issue. And oxalates over time can lead to things like kidney stones. The oxalate crystals can form within the brain, whether it's in the brain substance or in the meningeal layer around the brain. Oxalates can get into the peripheral nervous system. Oxalates can also accumulate in different endocrine tissue like thyroid. This is oxalates crystals forming in the follicular space of the thyroid gland. Oxalates often accumulate in joints, in muscle, and connective tissue, causing pain. And the organic acid test allows us to evaluate for high oxalic acid. It gives us a couple markers of genetic imbalances as well. In many cases, food is the major contributing factor to high oxalates. That's what was happening in this particular case, was suspected high consumption of soy, which is very high in oxalates, causing the oxalic levels to be extremely high. Bladder irritability, pain and urination but no confirmation of infection, urethral pain, vulvar pain in women, body aches, burning feeling in muscles, fibromyalgia-like discomfort. All of these things have been associated with high oxalic acid accumulation in the body. It's not always a kidney stone problem. Many foods are very high in oxalates, such as spinach, soy products, and others. And so dietary intervention is key in reducing oxalates, but also treating underlying fungal problems is important too if they exist. It's known that oxalates can interact with calcium and other minerals, but they can also interact with metals such as mercury and lead. In fact, the mercury oxalate crystal or salt is approximately 100,000 times less soluble than calcium oxalate salt. Many interventions can help in lowering oxalates, but the organic acid test helps us to detect for fungal problems, as well as the existence of high oxalate. Diet is always key. We can incorporate calcium, magnesium supplementation, probiotics, and B6, which also are helpful in reducing oxalate accumulation. This was a particular case from a number of years ago. This was actually a teenager with some attention problems, fatigue, and body aches and pain. We can see that the arabinose level is very high, indicating invasive Candida, as well as our oxalic acid. So they go on a low oxalate diet, and we start treating a Candida problem with different antifungals and botanicals over time. As the months rolled on, we can see the arabinose level starting to drop. The oxalate levels might go up initially as the body starts getting rid of oxalates, but then over time the levels start to drop accordingly, and so by the end of that time frame, which was about 9-10 months, there was a complete normalization of both the arabinose and the oxalic acid. Reason number 5 for the organic acid test is to evaluate for mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, the mitochondria are the energy factories within our cells. All of our body, our brain nervous system, our immune system, our digestive system, etc., depend on healthy levels of ATP being produced by our mitochondria. But the mitochondria are very vulnerable to nutritional deficiencies and toxicity. We know that environmental chemicals can cause mitochondrial problems. Heavy metals, vaccine reactions are known to be causative. Poor methylation issues, nutritional deficiencies, as well as endogenous toxins being produced by Clostridia, as well as fungal infections. So the organic acid test gives us insight into the Krebs cycle. Okay, things that are related, such as succinic acid, malic acid, for example. It also gives us insight into how amino acids are sequenced through mitochondrial activity. And there's other markers on the test too, such as fatty acid metabolites, which also have a link to mitochondrial issues. So it's a very important component of the organic acid test to give some type of representation of mitochondrial dysfunction and then correlating that information with other things that the OAT provides, such as oxalates, such as Clostridia, such as yeast, which themselves can contribute to mitochondrial problems. And we know that activity of what's called the citric acid cycle, which is also the Krebs cycle, activates activity in the electron transport chain. That's called oxidative phosphorylation to make ATP, that cellular energy currency that we need to run the machinery of our body. Reason number 6, and that's to evaluate neurotransmitter imbalances. Dopamine and norepinephrine, epinephrine metabolism is very important in balance of our autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic activity. These can be linked, or elevations can be linked to various things such as a mental emotional stress, physical pain, chronic infections, and even some of the Clostridia toxins we know can manipulate dopamine metabolism, causing what's called homovinylic acid, the HVA, to elevate as a organic acid representation of high levels of dopamine. So here we have a situation of creosol, 4-creosol coming from Clostridia bacteria, inhibiting that dopamine beta hydroxylase enzyme, causing dopamine levels to be elevated. And we already know that elevated dopamine over time can be a contributive problem to neurological issues. Same thing with HPA. Okay, it inhibits that enzyme, causing HVA to elevate, again, causing potential neurological issues. And then after treatment, if we treat the Clostridia correctly, many times we'll have an improvement in homovinylic acid. And so that's a really key point of the organic acid test from Great Plains, is understanding how Clostridia can interfere with neurochemical imbalance. Reason number 7 is to evaluate for serotonin and potentially toxic compounds such as quinolinic acid. It's been known that the tryptophan, what's called the tryptophan kynurenine metabolic pathway, can be linked to different types of neurological and mental health problems such as major depression. What happens is tryptophan is linked to the serotonin pathway, but it's also linked to what's called the quinolinic acid, kynurenic acid pathway. Stress, cortisol, can increase an enzyme called tryptophan 2,3-dioxygenase. Other factors like beta amyloid seen in Alzheimer's can increase the activity of another enzyme called indoleamine 2,3-dioxygenase, causing increases of quinolinic acid and decrease of tryptophan conversion to serotonin. Here's our quinolinic acid. Metabolically, quinolinic acid actually helps to stimulate what's called NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, which is actually important in energy metabolism. Different types of stressors, interferon from immune stimulation, chronic infections, even a niacin deficiency can pull tryptophan away from the serotonin pathway into the kynurenic acid, quinolinic acid pathway. So these could be reasons why our quinolinic acid is elevated. The problem with quinolinic acid is that too much can cause too much brain stimulation, something called excitotoxicity through what are called NMDA receptors. And NMDA receptors are something that's well recognized in Alzheimer's disease, for example. Too much activity of the NMDA receptors can lead to oxidative stress in the brain, as well as triggering inflammatory reactions within brain cells. Reason number 8 is to evaluate folate metabolism. Pyrimidines are 2 types of chemicals that are linked to uracil and thymine as part of our RNA and DNA at the nuclear level in our cells. So we know that thymine is linked to DNA, uracil is linked to RNA. So these have a relationship to folate and folate metabolism. Now this gets fairly complex and requires much more lecturing ability beyond just this lecture. But we know that our folate cycle and our methylation cycle is also linked to what's called our transsulfuration cycle. So if we drew a line right under homocysteine, below the line is transsulfuration, above the line is methylation and folate cycle. And so we need adequate folate in order to activate methylation. But that folate is also important for supporting function of RNA and DNA at the nuclear level. So if we've got a problem in MTHFR or our 5-methylfolate, we can end up having a problem at our genetic level as well. So the organic acid gives some insight into that. Reason number 9 is to evaluate for various nutritional markers. And there are many that show up on the organic acid test. We can get an idea of B12 deficiency, of biotin deficiencies, of CoQ10 deficiencies, riboflavin deficiencies, even get an assessment for things like pantothenic acid, which is actually B5, B6 metabolism as well. And we know that these are important because they play a critical role acting as cofactors in different types of biochemical mechanisms, including mitochondrial activity. And finally, reason number 10 is to evaluate for glutathione production problems and what are called inborn errors of metabolism. Phosphoric acid is a marker that gives an insight into the potential aspects of vitamin D metabolic problems. There's a lot of reasons that phosphoric acid can be high or low. The most common reason the values are elevated would be due to some kind of metabolic acidosis type of problem. So somebody who may have, let's say, diabetic ketoacidosis might have elevated phosphoric. Low values are most commonly linked to vitamin D deficiency. By the way, I should point out, metabolic acidosis is a common cause. The most common cause of elevated phosphoric is people who are consuming too much soda pop because it contains phosphoric acid as an ingredient. Low values, it's one of the good things to do is to check for vitamin D status. Now, there are on the organic acid test also markers of what are called inborn errors of metabolism. And these are rare kinds of disorders usually seen in children, but they're important. And one of the other reasons to do the organic acid test as well is anybody who has any kind of neurodegenerative or metabolic disease, you absolutely want to do the OAT. People with seizure disorders, it's really essential. And again, other types of chronic health problems. Now, we have 2 courses through Integrative Medicine Academy. We have the Essential OAT Mastery course, which is to learn the fundamentals of OAT testing, understanding which markers are most commonly seen on the OAT test and how to clinically correlate that information. You can go to essentialoatmasterycourse.com. That course naturally transitions into our Advanced OAT Mastery course, which is the most comprehensive online course on the implementation and interpretation of every single marker on the organic acid test from Great Plains Lab. But that course will also help you understand other markers on other organic acid tests as well. Both of these courses complement each other extremely well, and you'll come away after going through these courses very, very competent in the implementation and interpretation and clinical utilization of organic acid testing in clinical practice. We also have a website called Functional Medicine Clinical Rounds, which is for healthcare practitioners, where you can schedule one-on-one consults with myself, Dr. Wooler, and my partner, Dr. Trincatella of Integrative Medicine Academy. We go through lab reviews. We can do, case breakdown, troubleshooting, suggestions, recommendations. There's also a lot of content, clinical Pearl videos, downloadable documents, as well as a monthly live clinical rounds webinar. We also have a very interactive forum. So members of Functional Medicine Clinical Rounds can interact with us on a daily basis if you choose through the forum where you can post questions to us. So check out functionalmedicineclinicalrounds.com. The clinical data sheets are a great resource. These come out weekly as a downloadable document highlighting different types of lab tests or clinical pearls that are very user-friendly with pertinent information for your practice. There's also a website called Lab Test Plus that actually provides access to certain types of integrative functional medicine lab testing, including many of those from Great Plains Lab, including the organic acids test. Each test comes with a written interpretation and what's called an action step suggestions based on the relevant information and the objective information of that lab profile. You can get more information at labtestplus.com. You can email to labtestplus@gmail.com for questions. And again, more information about Integrative Medicine Academy and some of our courses, you can go to integrativemedicineacademy.com, or you can email us at integrativemedicineacademy@gmail.com. Again, this is Dr. Kurt Wooler for Integrative Medicine Academy. Thank you.